Hello Commanders, with the next major event Polarized Light out now, and the ranking maps out along with it, I thought I would take some time to make a video explaining the echelons that you'll need if you want to attempt the ranking. Please note that this is only for map 1, Labyrinth Defense, the day ranking map. However, with the changes to the scoring for EN's server, there's a good chance that map 2, the night map in chapter 5, now has a higher score ceiling, so I'll be researching that, and once I figured out some stuff, I'll make another video specifically for map 2. In the description, there's a doc with the teams that I will be using for my first attempt at the day map, if you want a reference. Now, this is just going to be a guide or a reference of sorts for team compositions and dolls that are the better dolls that you can use. If you want to learn how the map works or understand the structure of the ranking, there's other guides. You can watch VODs of the CN or KR server runs, or there's Tenma Gab's Polarized Light Ranking Explained video, which is a bit outdated but still explains it very well. I'll link that in the description. Before I continue, I'd just like to note that I'll try to keep this general, so directed towards mostly all players who can attempt the ranking, but as I'll be trying for the top ranks, there will be a lot directed towards that as well. So first, let's break down how the echelons are structured. This is assuming you have 10 echelons. Some of these teams are a bit dependent on the strategy that you'll be using, mainly how many parachute fairies you'll be fielding. I'll try to account for different strategies and different amounts of parachute fairies, but you can realistically use anywhere between 1 to 7, though you want to use at least 2 if you can. So the echelons will be divided as approximately the following. You'll have 1 Deathstack Killer, 1 Boss Killer and M4 NPC Escort, 2 utility teams, and then 1 to 2 404 NPC Escort, and up 4 of some combination of parasweepers and camping teams. Now, a large portion of that is dependent on how many parachute fairies you're able to field. I would say minimum you want to have is 2, if you can. You can get it with 1, but it makes it much more difficult. Now, if we take a look at the ranking map, we can divide it into 5 different zones. On the left side, there's M4 NPC with the E-lids, the middle spawn area, the top right Deathstack zone, the bottom right trash mob zone, and lastly, the minimap area with 404 on the bottom left. For future reference, I'll be referencing these 5 zones when discussing where the echelons are used and what they'll be fighting. So, starting with the Deathstack Killer echelon, which is, as the name suggests, will be the team that you'll be using to kill the Deathstacks in the top right Deathstack zone. Now, in the old servers, the primary echelon that was used had 3 machine guns, 2 handgun buffers, which also tank, and the most important part was a 5-star SL10 Beach Fairy, which was the Shattered Connection ranking reward fairy. So the composition has a few variations, but have roughly the same DPS capabilities, but you can swap PKP out for either bar mod or RPK 16. However, Cord and M1895 CB or KFC you have to have them. You can't switch those 2 out. Cord is absolutely needed because she has AoE DPS with her piercing shots, and KFC because she switches to her backup rounds to continuously shoot. And then Python is needed as well, but you can switch, if you happen to not be around for Valhalla, you can swap out Jill for either Contender or Grizzly if you really need to. But I would try to use Contender over Grizzly. But you'd have to set her skill to manual. Though I wouldn't recommend it if you can avoid it. You can replace Beach with a 5-star stat stick, such as Artillery, such as an Artillery Fairy or a Command Fairy. Though it'll still make it much harder because you need the skill of Beach Fairy. Now, if you don't have any of these prepared, you can still kill some of the Deathstacks, but the team becomes much more difficult, and what you can kill becomes much more specific. So you can use something such as KSG, swap in a Grape, and swap out these 2 from some other handgun buffers, and you need to have at least a 2-star Armor Fairy in order to take tank, and you can use this team to kill the non-Typhon or the laser tank Deathstack teams. Now, one bonus that EN has over the older servers for this ranking is that we have KSVK mod for Polarized Light, as the old servers didn't get her mod until after PL. So since we have her mod, we will most likely be replacing the 3 MG 2 handgun Deathstack team with this rifle handgun Deathstack team. With the same ferry, and the core of this team will be KSVK Mod, Webley, and Calico. The last two, Python or Type 88 that I have here, are still yet to be determined as we need to test more. After testing, I'll most likely make another video with a solid team for this. Now moving on to the boss team, or the boss killer team. This fights the Ares mech that spawns, but before it does that, as the spawn requirement is 60 kills, it escorts, or depending on the strategy you use, it escorts the M4 NPC on the left side of the map to the radar, because if the M4 NPC caps the radar, you get 100k points. So it'll be killing the elids and the zombie bosses on that side. There are quite a few variations of this boss killer team, so I'll go over the two main versions, the Korean server and the Chinese server versions, and mention which dolls can be used. But basically there are 3 parts for the dolls used in this fight. The MG or MGs used to kill the initial wave of Cernitus and the following Aegis and Cyclops. The shielders that tank and shield the AoE damage from the Ares laser. And dolls to DPS the mech after the ads are gone. The fairy is usually a 5-star statistics. The most common ones I saw were either a 5-star warrior with skill or a 5-star command fairy. Though if you're doing the 7 para strat, a 5-star para does work. For the elid fights, the reasoning is generally similar, as there's the regular elids and then the smashers, or the boss zombies. You need the AoE, the single target, and the shielding. So here is the comp that I'll be using, and the one I saw most often in the Korean server teams. So Chord's there for the same reason as the Deathstacks. Then you have P22 and HSTK to tank and to provide shields to negate the AoE lasers and any extra damage. And then you have Deagle, or Desert Eagle, and Python for extra damage buffs, and because they are very good single target damage against the actual boss after the ads are gone. Now this was the common team for the Chinese server high rankers, with a few variations. Deagle and HS2K are there for the same reasons as KR. And then the MG was swapped to Negev for the longer fights. And as well, LWMG was swapped out by the KR server for P22, but provided shields with a mod 2, which I don't have. But then Hanyang was also used for AoE DPS and boss DPS. Now you can also replace anything like Lewis, Cord, Bar Mod, any of the longer KFC, any of the longer machine guns do work as well. Now, Desert Eagle and HS2K aren't completely necessary, but they'll make these fights way, way easier, and I would highly recommend you slot them in. At a minimum, HS2K for the AoE shielding. But pretty much as long as you can fulfill the 3 criteria for this fight, which are MG DPS to kill the ads, ability to tank with shields, and have single target DPS afterwards to actually kill the boss, then you should be okay. If you don't have a 5-star stat stick, however, you can get away with lower rarity fairies, but the dolls you use becomes much more important. For example, if you use a stat stick that's only 3-star, for example, like a 3-star command, that will extend the fight quite a bit because you have less damage, which means the dolls you use will become much more important. So in that case, you'd most definitely need Cord and HS2K for the shielding and the extra damage to make sure everything is dead. Next up are the utility teams, which in the old servers, they used landmine fairies to debuff the Deathstacks, and they generally stay between the right side of the middle spawn area and the Deathstack zone in order to lay mines. However, as of now, for EN, there's an unfortunate change for the scoring system in which the points you get for killing an enemy changed from 10% of max CE to 10% of its current CE. So this means that using landmine fairies, which reduce the CE of the enemy, nets us less points, so that if you're attempting to go for a high rank, we can no longer use them. However, if you're not worrying about your rank and you just want to complete the map, they're still very viable. So the plan now is instead to have these teams use Sue and Construction Fairy in order to in order to buff our echelons instead of debuffing the enemy echelons or the enemy death stacks. But as I said before, if you're not trying to go for top 50, you can still use landmines fine. The rarity of these fairies doesn't matter. All that's matter is having them at SL10, as any extra is just extra combat stats, which they don't do a whole lot of fights in the first place, so it's not a huge deal. But on to the actual echelons for these utility teams. We use 2 of them, but there's a whole lot of variability in how you build these. So out of all the teams I looked at, these 2 teams were the most variable in how you can build them. But mainly, they generally compose of 1 to 2 ARs, 1 to 2 rifles, 0 to 2 handguns, and 1 to 2 SMG tanks. So a lot of the teams I found were mixed, and I would similarly recommend them, as they don't often fight, but they need to catch a variety of enemies. So you want to have a little bit of everything so that they can catch everything. So with that being said, I'll go over what I'm using for mine. I structured my teams in a very specific way because of what I have. I wanted to use NTW mod, so I slotted into this team. So I'm using my NTW as my rifle in order to catch any armor, and I can also use M4 cannon as well, but I'm also using these 2 to catch any doggos that spawn in the bottom right trash mob area, as ARs are better than rifles against those. And then for my defense, I'm using P90 as my defensive SMG and HS2K because of AoE shield, and it can also shield the clones, just so that I don't need to ever repair this team. And then using Sue as my utility fairy. And then my second team is I structured around wanting to use Mosin mod. So I have RFB for the dogs, Mosin for any armor, HS2K for shields, CMS because of Asian tanking, and I want to try to use Agent Vector because of the taunt. So for more survivability. And then in this team, I will have my construction fairy. So the level and rarity doesn't really matter, but as long as you have it at SL10 for the maximum amount of buff. But I like to reiterate that these teams have a high degree of variability, so here's a few on screen now, and I'll put an Imgur link in the description with a bunch if you'd like to reference them if you're not quite sure what to do with your team. But as a quick reference, I recommend at least 1 rifle, at least 1 AR, at least 1 SMG tank, and at least 1 handgun. And the last spot is up to you. Alright, so the next 2 types of echelons are all kind of together in how they are built, as these are all teams that can use parachute fairies, and as such they are structured very similarly but that depends on what you have. But to start, the 404 Escort team will be parachuted into the minimap section in the bottom left to clear Polarized and then cap everything there. And then on screen are 2 specific examples of CN echelons that were used in the minimap section. But moving on to the parasweeper camper area, since these are all built similarly, they are very variable, but it depends on what you have. So I'll be using 6 parachutes for my own, and my own team to reflect that in the dock. But if you don't have that many, don't feel discouraged, because you can get a high score with 2 still. But here, as you can see here, this is the optimal sweeper package per se. So you have a Great, P22, MP5 mod, and a parachute fairy. Now what you slot in else is 1 more rifle and 1 more handgun. Now MP5 mod is the best force shielder because that's the type of SMG you want to be using for these teams to force shield tank. You can also use Thompson or G36C. MP5 mod is the best because she also buffs rifles, but Thompson and G36C also work just as well. MP5 mod is a luxury. Then you'll want to match another rifle and handgun. For example, a common pairing is having a common pairing that was used on the KR server, but not so much on the CN server, was M200 with a firepower buffing handgun, such as Grizzly or such as Grizzly or K5 as such. M200 is a solid choice because of sure hits, so the accuracy debuff doesn't matter. and you can get the guaranteed hits on the enemies. One particular team that was often used on KR was, in place of Grizzly, there was a Cord. And this was used to clear out several or multiple enemies. Oops. This as such with your highest rarity parachute. If you don't have a lot of grapes, don't worry, it's not the end of the world. She just makes things easier, and I would recommend you to use as many grapes as you have, though, especially paired with P22 for these teams. Sejin, a high-ranking player on the Chinese server, made a team analysis infographic which is reflective of the CN strats, so it doesn't include what KR used, such as the Cord M200 or the M200 firepower handgun teams, but it is a really good starting point and reference guide if you want to, if you're not sure how to build your parasweepers or you need ideas for which rifles and handguns to use. So I'll link that in the description. Please take a look at that. KR tended towards adding multiple M200s in their teams over some of the self-buffing rifles, but they did also tend towards R93 as well. So an option that we have, or that Ian has that the old servers didn't, is Rico from the Gunslinger Girl collaboration, as she pairs very well. She's a very good rifle, and she pairs really well with how these teams are structured. So you can pair her very well with HS2K in your team and P22, which makes these fights much, much easier because you have the defensive options, where you can structure your team like this and have the CD tiles there. But as a general rule of thumb for these parasweeper teams, which also are structured the same as your 404 escort teams, you want to have 2 rifles, 2 handguns that synergize with those rifles, and an SMG tank. Generally, you want your SMG tank to be a 4-shielder, such as MP5 Mod, G36C, or Thompson, but other SMGs such as Roe, P90, or Dorothy also work. CMS can also work too. So you want to field as many grapes and P22s as possible, but if you don't have those, please refer to the infographic. There's lots of other options available to you. Now, if you don't have a lot of parachute fairies, you can also make camper teams instead, which such as Double Jupiter with M4 and IWS and rate of fire buffing handguns. Or you can make rifle teams similar to the parasweeper teams, except instead of a parachute fairy, you can add a taunt, a twin would be the best option, but you can also add stat sticks if you don't have anything else. AR teams also work, but you have to be very selective with what they fight, as they are very good against doggos, but are unable to fight any of the heavily armored enemies such as the Hydras, which is why I recommend having, for your camper teams and your utility teams, having AR and rifles in them. So an AR team that would be good are similar to the doggo camping teams from Shattered Connection ranking, such as RFB, AN94, a buffing AR such as AUG, Angelica, or Raby Roll, and either 2 SMG tanks or an SMG tank and a handgun buffer. Now, lastly, there is the Heavy Ordnance Corps. So if we could take a quick look at them, there is a maximum of 4 for this ranking map. You'll be primarily using, or the 3 that you'll be primarily using are 2B, M2, and AT4. So you want to have, as they work the best, the air AoE damage works the best against KCCO and these fights, so you want to have them maxed out if possible, especially 2B and AT4. And the lot for the fourth hawk that you'll be using, I would recommend using AGS, as you don't really need BGM because there's no shields to be broken. And you could use QLZ because we'll be able to 5-star her soon with theater going on right now, but most people should have AGS already maxed out, so just use AGS. And that's about it for the compositions for map 1 of Polarized Light ranking. If you have any questions or concerns, I plan on streaming my runs on Twitch CPU permitting, if my computer allows me to. So come stop by and ask if you have any questions, or come join my Discord and ask me there. Link is in the description. And remember to always love your waifu.